My name is Calliope Vance, and I just turned 32. Exactly 72 hours before I was supposed to put on a white dress and walk down the aisle, my father called. It was a damp Tuesday afternoon. I was out in my studio, up to my elbows in wet porcelain, throwing the final batch of miniature vases for the reception tables. The wheel was humming. My hands were coated in gray slip, and when my phone vibrated against the wooden work table, the screen flashed my dad's contact. I nudged the answer button with my clean knuckle, expecting a quick question about parking. He didn't even say hello. Just 6 words, heavy and flat. I can't walk you down, Calliope. I let the wheel spin to a halt. The wet clay collapsed into a lopsided lump. I wiped my forearm slowly on my canvas apron, breathing in the smell of damp earth, and just stared at the wall for maybe 10 seconds. 10 seconds is an eternity when your heart is dropping into your stomach. Serafina says it's going to be too hard for her, he finally muttered. Serafina, my older sister, 35, legally married but teetering on the edge of a messy divorce, a mother of 2, and the undisputed gravitational center of my parents' universe. Every choice they made somehow orbited her feelings. Now, apparently, my wedding day was doing the same. Her marriage is falling apart, he added, his voice thin with guilt. You have to understand. I understood perfectly, but this was my day, not hers. Barely 15 minutes later, my mother called to ensure the nail was hammered all the way in.
I grew up in Oak Creek, a manicured suburb where everyone hired the same landscaping company and kept their emotional baggage neatly hidden behind plantation shutters. Serafina was the undisputed golden child. She possessed flawless pitch, captained the debate team, and dominated science fairs. Whenever we had neighbors over for summer barbecues, my dad would rest a heavy, proud hand on her shoulder and declare, "This is Serafina. She's going to Johns Hopkins." He spoke about her future as if it were already carved into marble. I, on the other hand, was the kid who routinely ruined the upholstery with clay dust. When I was 14, I built a crude raku kiln in the far corner of our backyard. I dragged discarded fire bricks from a demolished chimney down the street, secured them with rusted chicken wire, and sealed the gaps with mud. It looked like a medieval oven, an absolute eyesore. But by late summer, it was firing copper-glazed bowls that shimmered like oil slicks. That same year, the county art exhibition fell on the exact same afternoon as Serafina's state-level piano recital. I entered a collection of hand-thrown vases, documenting the temperature controls and glazing chemistry. I won the grand prize. The gold ribbon was proudly taped to my display table by the time my dad finally rushed into the gymnasium. He arrived 40 minutes late. The janitors were already collapsing the folding tables. "Sorry, kid. Serafina had an encore," he panted, checking his pager. He glanced at my ribbon, gave a stiff nod, and muttered, "Nice work," with the exact same enthusiasm you'd give a stranger holding the door for you. That brick kiln sat in our backyard for a decade. I patched the mortar twice. My mother constantly complained it ruined the property value. My dad just looked right through it. But it kept firing beautiful things, year after year, entirely indifferent to whether anyone inside the house cared to notice. My high school graduation happened to land on the same week Serafina received her official acceptance to medical school. Naturally, my parents decided to merge the celebrations into one expensive dinner at a downtown French bistro. 3 toasts were given that night. All 3 were exclusively about Serafina. My dad raised his expensive Bordeaux, "To our future surgeon." My mother dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, whispering about how she always knew her eldest was destined for greatness. I chewed my steak in silence and clapped politely when required. Not a single breath was wasted on my high school diploma. I graduated with honors,
and an acceptance letter to a prestigious fine arts academy for ceramics. I paid the enrollment deposit myself, using the money I'd saved from teaching kids pottery classes at the community center since I was 15. When I finally told my mother about the art degree, she slowly lowered her wine glass and stared at me with profound pity. "Pottery isn't a profession, Calliope," she sighed. A few years later, I overheard her telling my aunt the exact same thing over the phone. "Calliope is making cups for a living. I don't even know how to explain it to my book club." Meanwhile, Serafina's medical school tuition was covered entirely by my parents. 50 grand a year, paid in full. My mother dropped that number casually at holiday dinners, as if she were accepting a humanitarian award. My tuition? I took out federal loans and worked 3 part-time jobs. Nobody ever brought up my student debt over turkey and cranberry sauce. Then, Serafina married a venture capitalist named Preston. The rehearsal dinner was dripping in champagne and forced laughter. A few years later, the grandchildren arrived. Little Leo and then Maya. My dad retired from his accounting firm the very same year Maya was born, and instantly, his entire existence narrowed down to those 2 children. He drove to Serafina's estate 3 times a week, assembled their playground, and read the same bedtime stories until his voice gave out. Serafina noticed his devotion, and because she is who she is, she immediately realized it was a currency she could spend. She started using the kids as leverage. It began small, demanding the head of the Thanksgiving table, or insisting my dad ask me to step out of a family portrait because my hair was clashing with the aesthetic. He folded every single time. But I finally caught the true depth of it last winter. I had stepped into my parents' kitchen to grab a glass of water when I heard my dad on speakerphone in the study. "If you walk Calliope down the aisle, I'm not bringing the kids to Christmas this year." Serafina's voice was remarkably steady, weaponized and cool. "It's too much for me right now. You know I'm suffering." I heard my father's ragged exhale. A long, pathetic pause. Then, "All right, Fina. All right." My mother walked into the kitchen. Silas was a retired clockmaker. He had calloused, steady hands and lived alone in a drafty Victorian house he had restored with Julian's mother before she passed away from leukemia. His basement was a chaotic symphony of ticking gears, brass pendulums, and a radio perpetually playing old jazz. Silas didn't treat me like a stranger. By our 3rd Sunday dinner, he was calling me Callie. By the 2nd month, he surprised me in my studio with a custom-built adjustable throwing stool made of solid cherry wood. He had spent weeks carving the seat to perfectly match the curve of the wheel. Right underneath the rim, hidden from the world but placed exactly where my fingertips would naturally rest, he had engraved my initials, CV. "Got clay deeply buried under your nails," Silas had gruffly noted the first time he visited my workspace. "Good. That means you've spent your day making something real." Nobody in my bloodline had ever looked at my hands and seen something to be proud of. Julian proposed to me a year later, right in the middle of a gallery showing where my largest pieces were being exhibited. He dropped to one knee beside a porcelain installation I had poured my soul into. I burst into tears and said yes before he could even fetch the ring from his coat pocket. I had designed my own wedding invitations, hand-pressed paper with delicate painted vines. I drove to my parents' house and shoved one into their mailbox, simply because looking at their faces felt too exhausting. Against all my better judgment, I explicitly asked my dad to give me away. He had agreed immediately. A quick, knee-jerk yes, like a man agreeing to take out the trash. Julian had just wrapped his arms around my waist that night, resting his chin on my shoulder. "You know exactly who they are, Callie," he had murmured. "I know," I sighed, "but I just want to give them one final chance to surprise me." Julian didn't argue. He never tried to fix my family. He just made sure I was fiercely protected when they inevitably broke my heart again. Which brings us back to the phone call. The 6 words. The wet clay ruined on my wheel. "Did Serafina threaten you with the kids again?" I asked my father, my voice shockingly level. The background noise of his television bled through the receiver. His voice dropped to a shameful whisper, terrified his own wife might overhear him. "She said if I walked you, I wouldn't see Leo and Maya for the holidays." There it was, the ultimate currency. He traded his daughter's wedding for a Christmas morning with his grandchildren, and he did it without a second thought. "Okay, Dad," I whispered. "Calliope."
Eventually, I stood up, walked back into my darkened studio, and found the cherry wood stool Silas had built for me. I slid my hand underneath the seat, found the deeply carved CV, and traced the letters until the lump in my throat finally dissolved. The next morning, Wednesday, just 2 days before the ceremony, Julian made breakfast. He slid a plate of scrambled eggs and fresh chives across the kitchen island, sitting opposite me with his mug of coffee. He didn't push. He just waited. "My dad isn't walking me," I said, staring at my fork. "I figured," Julian replied softly. He didn't launch into a tirade against my family. He just looked at me with those deeply anchoring eyes and asked, "So, what do you want to do? Because I won't let you walk alone unless you truly want to." "I don't want to walk alone," I admitted, the admission feeling heavy on my tongue. "But I have no one else." Julian took a slow sip of his coffee. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Silas has been quietly ironing his best charcoal suit for the last 3 days, Julian murmured. "I caught him in the hallway watching YouTube tutorials on how to tie a half Windsor knot." My head snapped up. "I can't ask Silas to do that. That's a massive burden." "Callie," Julian said, reaching across the island to cover my clay-stained hand with his own. "That man built you a custom stool from scratch, just because he noticed your back hurt. He drives across town on weekends just to oil the bearings on your wheel. He set a permanent plate for you at his dining table 3 years ago, and he has never once taken it away." Julian squeezed my fingers. "He's been waiting for you to ask. He just didn't want to overstep." Hearing that didn't break my heart. Instead, something rigid and terrified inside my chest finally cracked completely open, letting in a warmth I had spent my entire life starving for. It took me exactly 3 minutes sitting on that freezing porch to understand the truth. The father I desperately wanted had been right in front of me for 3 years. He was the man sanding mahogany in his basement, calling me Callie, and quietly showing up for every single milestone my biological father had conveniently ignored. "I'll ask Silas today," I told Julian. An hour later, Ilara called. She was my maid of honor, and the kind of fiercely loyal friend who would tell you your glaze was dripping, and then stay up until 2 a.m. helping you fix it. She had just run into Serafina at an upscale salon downtown. "Your sister wasn't exactly using her inside voice," Ilara warned over the phone. "What did she say?" "She was venting to her stylist about your wedding, complaining about how stressful it is for her and how it's making everything about you again." I closed my eyes. Again. I sat with Ilara's words for a long time. She was absolutely right. Serafina didn't want my dad to walk me down the aisle because it would trigger her grief. She wanted him to stay home because my happiness was the one thing in her orbit she couldn't control. Sabotaging my walk down the aisle was just her pulling the emergency brake.
To really understand it, you have to know what happened last Thanksgiving. Serafina hosted dinner because my mother insisted her dining room had better natural light. Preston sat at the head of the long oak table wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than my kiln. He checked his phone 12 times during the turkey carving. I counted, simply because looking at his glowing screen was less painful than listening to my mother compliment Serafina's beige curtains. Serafina was loud that evening. Not joyous, just loud in that frantic, suffocating way people get when they are trying to drown out a very quiet room. She laughed sharply at jokes that made no sense. She kept topping off wine glasses that were mostly full. She reached out and squeezed Preston's shoulder twice. He didn't even blink. Then, 5-year-old Maya dropped the grenade. She had a smear of sweet potato on her cheek. She asked the question with the brutal, innocent clarity only a kindergartner possesses. "Why does Daddy sleep in the guest room?" The clinking of silverware stopped instantly. Preston finally looked up from his emails. Serafina's face didn't register anger or shock. It just collapsed. Something dark and completely exhausted broke through her flawless veneer. My dad violently cleared his throat and asked little Leo if he wanted more dinner rolls. But I was staring at my sister's hands. They were trembling violently as she set down the gravy pot. A severe, uncontrollable shake. 2 seconds later, she locked her jaw, plastered on a terrifying smile, and asked who wanted pie. Her marriage wasn't hitting a rough patch. It was crashing into a brick wall. And my wedding was...
On Wednesday morning, I drove out to Silas's house. The Victorian felt drafty, but smelled intensely of warm cedar and brewing coffee. The basement door was open. The faint sound of a muted jazz trumpet drifted up the stairs. I found him carefully applying shellac to a massive, intricate grandfather clock case. He wore a heavy canvas apron, the pockets sagging with the weight of small brass tools. I hovered near the bottom step for a long moment before he finally noticed my shadow. "Hey, Callie," he smiled, wiping a drop of varnish off his thumb. "Coffee's fresh upstairs." "Silas?" He stopped moving. He must have recognized the brittle edge in my voice because he carefully set his brush across the tin rim, turned around, and wiped his hands on a clean rag. "My dad backed out," I told him. "He isn't going to walk me down the aisle." Silas didn't offer a hollow apology. He didn't ask for the dramatic details. He didn't shake his head in judgment or offer unsolicited advice about family dynamics. He just looked at me with those steady, anchoring eyes, Julian's eyes, and asked 4 simple words. "What time is it?" That was the entire negotiation. No hesitation, no awkward pause to check his schedule. He was varnishing a piece of wood, and in the span of a single heartbeat, he completely altered the trajectory of my wedding day, as if it had been his lifelong duty. "Saturday, 1 o'clock. "I'll be there at noon," he replied. He picked up his brush again, dipped it in the shellac, and added quietly, "I've been hoping you'd ask, Callie. I really have." I cried in my truck until my ribs ached. The next 2 days moved like a rushing river. Alara ruthlessly overhauled the seating chart, scratching out my father's name from the front row and replacing it with Silas. Julian dragged his dad to a tailor downtown. He texted me a picture from the fitting room. Silas standing stiffly in a sharp, tailored chokehold suit, his woke, roughened hands protruding from the pristine cuffs like they belonged to a different man entirely. Julian attached a message. I wrote my vows late Thursday night in my studio. The cherry wood throwing stool Silas built me sat to my left. I drafted the words on the back of an old glaze recipe card, crossing out grand declarations and settling for absolute honesty. My parents never called on Wednesday. My phone stayed completely silent through Thursday. I checked my screen twice before burying the phone at the bottom of my clay bin. Julian noticed the quiet. He didn't try to fill it with chatter. He just brewed chamomile tea and placed a mug next to my sketchbook. Let them assume I was walking alone. The heavy chapel doors would swing open on Saturday, and they would get their answer. On Thursday afternoon, there was a tentative knock at my front door. It was Ruth, my grandmother Evelyn's oldest friend. She was nearly 70 now, her silver hair pinned back tight, clutching a small, yellowed envelope against her chest. When Evelyn passed away from heart failure over a decade ago, Ruth was the one sitting in the hospital chair beside her. "Your grandmother made me promise to give you this," Ruth explained softly, her eyes glassy. "She handed it to me the week before her heart gave out, told me to hide it until the week you got married." The envelope felt fragile, thin as a moth's wing. My name was written on the front in Evelyn's elegant, sloping cursive. I opened it at my kitchen island, while Ruth watched in silence. The letter was brutally short. Evelyn never wasted ink. "Calliope, you are about to step into the most important room of your life. I wish I could be there to force your mother to sit quietly and let you shine. I wish I could make your father finally look at you. But I know how that house operates. So listen to me. You are a shaper of earth. You take mud and turn it into art. Do not wait for them to appreciate you. The people who actually show up for you, that is your family. Keep making beautiful things." I read the cursive script 3 times, carefully folded the brittle paper, and slipped it into the small clutch purse I planned to carry on Saturday. Family is who shows up. Friday evening was the rehearsal dinner. Silas drove across the city, arriving an hour early to help the caterers haul heavy crates of glassware because he physically couldn't watch young kids lift with their backs. There were 30 guests. All of them were on Julian's side, save for Alara, Ruth, a few girls from my community pottery classes, and my accountant. The venue was a stunningly restored dairy barn with exposed timber ceilings. I had thrown every single ceramic vase on the tables myself. They were filled with wild eucalyptus, white ranunculus, and sprigs of rosemary, because Grandmother Evelyn always said rosemary was for remembrance. During dinner, Silas stood up and tapped his water glass. He gripped it tightly, like he was holding a heavy chisel. "I'm not a man who talks much," he started, his voice rough. "But 3 years ago, a woman showed up at my son's construction site and stubbornly refused help carrying a 100-pound bag of cement. I liked her immediately. I never got a daughter. The universe just made me wait a little longer for the right one." The room went dead silent. Alara furiously dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Julian squeezed my knee under the tablecloth. While we were drinking wine under string lights, my father was sitting alone in his dark study across town. Alara found this out weeks later from a mutual acquaintance. He was staring at a framed photograph of me when I was 12, my face smeared with soot from that first backyard kiln, looking incredibly proud. My mother had forced him to tear that kiln down when I left for college. My mom walked into the study, irritated. "Are we actually going tomorrow?" "I think we have to," he replied quietly. "Fine, but we're sitting in the very back row. I refuse to let Calliope turn this into a spectacle," she snapped. My dad pulled out his phone. He opened my contact and slowly typed, "I am so proud of you, Calliope." He stared at the... Later that same Friday night, my phone vibrated. A text from Serafina. "I heard you aren't walking down the aisle alone. Who is walking you?" I stared at the glowing screen, flipped the phone face down onto the mattress, and ignored it. 10 minutes later, Alara sent me a screenshot. Serafina had texted her the exact same question, demanding answers. Alara's reply was a single, glorious punctuation mark. A period. I loved her deeply for that level of petty loyalty. Panic set in at my parents' house. My father texted Julian, accusing us of bringing a stranger to the ceremony just to embarrass the family. Julian typed out 3 furious responses, deleted all of them,
and simply put his phone away. Serafina sent one final dramatic declaration to a group chat I wasn't even in. If Mom and Dad are going, then I'm showing up too. So the stage was perfectly set. A massive wedding, a clockmaker in a tailored suit, and 3 uninvited spectators huddled in the back row, utterly convinced the entire day was secretly about them. Saturday morning arrived. I woke up at 5 in the morning. Julian had slept over at his dad's house, ostensibly for tradition, but mostly to make sure Silas didn't nervously pace a hole through his floorboards. I sat alone in my kitchen, sipping black coffee in the early morning fog. I looked down at my hands, the thick calluses on my palms from wedging cold clay, the faint silvery bone scar on my left wrist from pulling pots out of a 2,000-degree kiln, the permanent gray tint under my fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully erase. These hands had built a kiln out of scrap brick at 14. They had thrown hundreds of bowls to pay for college tuition. They had signed a lease.
I arrived at the barn venue a few hours later. The air smelled sharp, full of crushed eucalyptus and damp earth. Alara was already stationed in the bridal suite with her makeup brushes laid out like surgical instruments and a heavy pour of champagne in her hand. "You look like a woman who hasn't slept," she observed accurately, forcing me into a chair. She applied my makeup with ruthless efficiency. Ruth arrived shortly after, pressing a small velvet box into my palm. Inside rested my grandmother Evelyn's pearl drop earrings. The metal was still slightly warm from Ruth holding them on the drive over. A heavy knock echoed on the wooden door at 11:15. Alara swung it open. Silas stood in the hallway. He wore the immaculate charcoal suit and a navy tie Julian had picked out. His rough, stained hands hung awkwardly at his sides, completely out of place against the fine wool. He looked at me in my white dress, and for a man who spent his life calibrating the microscopic gears of antique clocks, his emotional control completely shattered. His jaw tightened, his eyes flooded instantly, and he had to blink hard against the ceiling. "Oh, Callie," he choked out. "Don't you dare cry, Silas. Alara just finished my eyeliner," I warned, though my own throat was burning. "I'm not crying," he grumbled, swiping his cheek. "It's just sawdust." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, exquisite box carved from dark cherry wood. Inside rested a custom boutonniere. He hadn't used fresh flowers. It was made of tiny, polished brass clock gears nestled inside dried green moss, tied tightly with leather twine. "I made it at dawn," he muttered, letting me pin it to his lapel. "Store-bought flowers just didn't seem right for us." Silas took a step back and looked at me, taking in the dress, the pearls, and my scarred hands clutching the fabric. "You look incredibly strong, Callie," he said softly. Nobody had ever used that word to describe me on a day meant for beauty, but coming from him, it was exactly the only word I needed to hear. He took a seat in the corner of the suite beside Ruth, a 60-something clockmaker and a retired school teacher, sitting quietly together like the most unexpected, fiercely loyal security detail a bride could ever ask for. At noon, I tiptoed over to the heavy velvet curtain separating the bridal suite from the main barn and peeked through the fabric. Julian's side of the aisle was packed to the brim with laughing cousins, college friends, and coworkers. My side of the aisle was smaller, but deeply rooted. It held my community, my pottery students, my fiercely protective friends, my accountant, my gallery manager. And then I looked at the very back row. Sitting defensively in the far corner were my father, my mother, and Serafina. They were dressed a little too formally for a barn wedding. They looked stiff, miserable, and judgmental, scanning the crowd like they were cataloging fire exits. My stomach dropped. For one fleeting, pathetic fraction of a second,
My inner child hoped they had shown up to finally make things right. Then I watched my mother lean over and whisper something sharp to Serafina.
Ilara winked at me, hoisted her bouquet, and stepped through the heavy curtains. The bright midday light swallowed her whole. Then an absolute heavy silence fell over the barn. It was that specific, breathless quiet when 200 people simultaneously stopped talking, leaving only the sound of the October wind rustling through the exposed rafters. The wedding coordinator touched my shoulder gently. "Are you ready?" I didn't answer immediately. I unclasped my small purse and pulled out Grandmother Evelyn's brittle envelope. I didn't need to read the whole thing, just the final line. The people who actually show up for you. That is your family. I folded the paper, snapped the purse shut, and took a deep breath. Silas materialized right beside me, offering his arm. His charcoal sleeve was impeccably pressed, but his hand was exactly as I knew it. Rough, calloused, heavily lined from 40 years of bending wood and brass to his will. I wrapped my fingers around his forearm. I felt the solid, unyielding muscle of a man who does not shake under pressure. "You good, Callie?" he whispered. The aisle stretched exactly 60 feet. I knew the precise measurement because I had meticulously planned the floral runners months ago. 60 feet of reclaimed pine planks. The irony of walking across aged wood toward my future, guided by a man who spent his life restoring aged wood, wasn't lost on me. I just counted his steps. Left, right, left. His pace was deliberate and perfectly measured, mirroring the exact rhythm he used when adjusting a delicate pendulum. It was the stride of a man who fully believed in his destination. The whispers started about 10 steps in. They weren't disruptive, just small, involuntary gasps as the guests pieced together the narrative in real time. The people who knew the truth, Ilara, Ruth, the women from my pottery workshops, my gallery manager, smiled fiercely and pressed tissues to their faces. The guests who didn't know the backstory looked at Silas, looking slightly confused, and immediately scanned the crowd for the biological father of the bride. They inevitably found a man hiding in the back row, aggressively staring at his own shoes. I never once looked at my father. I want to be entirely clear about that. I didn't turn my head, I didn't seek out his face in the crowd, and I didn't grant him the satisfaction of my anger. He simply didn't exist in that moment. Instead, I looked at Ruth, who was openly weeping in the front row. I looked at a large... Silas cleared his throat. He's a man who strictly avoids crowds. He restores broken things in the isolation of his basement, feeds people hearty stews, and quietly fixes their creaking doors. He never demands an audience. But today, he claimed the room. "Her family does," he said, his voice surprisingly loud. He paused, looking right at me before addressing the silent crowd. "All of us who showed up for her." The entire barn exhaled. A sharp, audible sob echoed from the front row. It was Ruth. Ilara's waterproof mascara was officially failing, and my gallery manager was desperately using the ceremony program to fan her face. Silas turned his body toward me. He took both of my clay-stained hands in his own and squeezed them fiercely. It was the exact same grip that had sanded my throwing stool. "Go get married, Callie," he whispered thickly. He gently placed my hand into Julian's waiting palm. Then he took 3 steps back, walked to the front row, and sat in the velvet chair explicitly labeled with his name, the chair my father had forfeited. Julian leaned past me, caught his dad's eye, and silently mouthed, "Thank you." Silas just nodded, folding his hands in his lap. I noticed a faint smear of varnish on his right cuff. The ceremony moved beautifully.
When the time came, I spoke the vows I had hastily scribbled on the back.
At 3:00, Silas tapped his champagne glass. The lively room instantly hushed. People recognize when something genuine is about to happen. "I'll keep this brief," Silas grumbled affectionately into the microphone. "Julian warned me that if I talked for more than 2 minutes, he'd cut the microphone cord." The room erupted in laughter. "And I've seen his tool belt, so I believe him." Silas looked down at his glass, turning it slowly. The first time Callie came over for Sunday dinner, I had an antique mantel clock sitting on the dining table. The porcelain face was shattered. I had completely given up on it. I figured it was ruined forever. She walked in, took one look at it, and asked if she could take it to her studio. He looked directly at me. A week later, she brought it back. She had pieced the porcelain together using gold lacquer. Kintsugi, she called it. She told me the cracks were part of its history, not the end of it. He wiped his jaw. I knew right then. Any woman who patiently pieces together a broken clock for a stranger is also the kind of woman who will piece together a grieving old man. The room absolutely. My father flinched, as if I had physically struck him. It was a tiny, pathetic recoil, the unavoidable reaction of a man forced to confront the ugly truth he had successfully dodged for 3 decades. Before he could stammer a response, my mother materialized. She clamped her manicured hand onto his elbow, her grip painfully tight. "Richard, go sit down," she ordered, steering him away like a misbehaving toddler. She leaned in toward me, her voice dropping to that lethal, controlled whisper I knew so well. "Don't you dare make a scene, Calliope." I calmly picked up the silver serving knife and slid a piece of tart onto a plate. "I'm cutting a pastry, Mom. You're the only one terrified of a scene." She glared, spun on her heel, and dragged him away. When the band announced the father-daughter dance, I walked onto the floor with Silas. We danced to a stripped-down cover of Stand By Me. Silas moved the way he worked, cautious, hyper-aware of his surroundings, keeping a respectful distance. "I'm going to ruin your shoes," he warned, stiffingly rigidly. "I know," I laughed. "Julian already warned me." Over in the far corner, Serafina sat alone at a table. Preston hadn't even shown up. She claimed he was on a business trip, but the empty chair beside her screamed the truth. Ruth walked over and sat next to her. "Evelyn would have been so incredibly proud of Calliope today," Ruth said casually. Serafina stiffened. "She would have been proud of you too, Serafina," Ruth added, "if you had ever given her a reason to be." Serafina immediately burst into tears and fled to the restroom. She stayed hidden for 20 minutes. My parents didn't stay for the cake cutting. They slipped out the side door around 5. My mother aggressively stared out the passenger window, refusing to answer. "She didn't even look at me," my father continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his own regret. "She looked at everyone else in that barn, but she looked right through me. And she was right to do it." My mother remained stubbornly silent. When they pulled into the driveway, she marched inside without a backward glance. My father stayed in the dark garage. He stared at the empty space where my teenage kiln used to sit. My mother had forced him to tear it down, but the earth underneath was still scorched black. Some things leave permanent scars on the ground long after they are removed. By Monday morning, I was back in my studio at 7. I unrolled a massive blueprint across my work table. It was the final schematic for the Children's Hospital mosaic. A massive tactile wall installation featuring textured ceramic animals that blind children could touch and trace. Julian walked in at 8 with a thermos of black coffee.
Silas showed up at 9 carrying a heavy, custom-made walnut serving tray with brass handles. "For the newly married couple," he casually grunted. As if he hadn't just altered the emotional trajectory of my entire life 48 hours prior. My phone buzzed around noon. A text from my father. "Can we talk?" I read it, flipped the phone over, picked up my carving loop, and went back to work on a clay bird. I had a wall to build.
I slowly set my tape measure down on the scaffolding. I didn't interrupt her. "I just thought you should know," Serafina sobbed, her breathing erratic and panicked. The flawless armor had completely shattered. I thought if I kept Mom and Dad completely focused on my misery, it would fill the empty space in my house. Preston was gone. The kids weren't enough to fix it. I desperately needed to be the center of something. She paused, taking a ragged breath. "And your wedding was in the way. Your happiness was in the way." I let her confession hang in the dusty air of the construction site. I didn't offer a soothing platitude, and I didn't scream at her. "Serafina," I said, my voice shockingly calm, "I genuinely hope you find the peace you need. I really do. But I am not your emotional punching bag anymore. I refuse to be the thing you stand on just to keep your head above water." She wept quietly into the receiver. I didn't try to stop her. I simply said goodbye and went back to measuring the wall. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. It wasn't a text or a cowardly email. It was handwritten by my father. I opened it alone in my studio. "Calliope," it read. "I should have walked you down that aisle. I knew it when I sat in the back row and watched another man do my job. I chose the path of least resistance. I let your mother convince me that avoiding conflict was the same as being a good father. It wasn't. It was just cowardice.